Welcome to Overnight Success, the podcast where we celebrate the incredible journeys of entrepreneurs and visionaries. While there's no such thing as true overnight success, hearing their stories of determination, persistence, and resilience can inspire us all. Presented by Draper University and hosted by Joannou.
I want to quickly mention that none of this is investment advice or financial advice, trading advice, or any sort of advice. And we do not recommend any cryptocurrency or investing in any projects. We're just showcasing the stories of founders. Welcome to another episode of Overnight Success. Today we're diving into the heart of Web3 with the driving force behind a company that's redefining digital ownership and the gaming landscape, Yat Siu, the co-founder and executive chairman of Animoca Brands, the powerhouse behind the Sandbox, and a massive portfolio of Web3 investments, joins us. We'll explore Yat's entrepreneurial roots, the pivotal moments in building Animoca Brands into a global leader, and his profound vision for a decentralized internet where digital property rights reign supreme. I'm sure you'll love the episode. Enjoy. Hey Yat, how you doing, my friend?
Very good. Thank you.
I'm very excited to talk to you. You got such an incredible background and Animoca, obviously kind of household name kind of thing. I want to go back though. I need to give the audience a little bit of context. Love to get a little bit of your story. If I have this right, you grew up in Austria.
That's correct.
Can you tell me a little bit about your childhood or maybe that earliest memory of your entrepreneurial journey?
Well, I mean, I guess it really just started really from when I was as a kid. I was studying music. My parents were musicians, which is why I studied music. Everything they say about Asian tiger parenting, it's all true, right? And I guess during that course of when I was studying music, I wasn't particularly great at it in comparison to my peers.
Oh, no.
Well, I suppose I got there through very hard work, but not necessarily the same kind of talent. But then what happened was that I had a computer. It was an Atari ST and had MIDI ports. And so I guess you could call it a little bit of cheating in the sense that I used basically a computer technology to write software to help me compose faster and better than my peers. And that software ended up getting recognized on a pre-internet service called Compuserve, for those of you who may remember. And that's actually how I got discovered by Atari. My actual sort of colleagues, as well as the professor, wasn't too sort of enamored by the idea that I was using technology to do something that, back then technology wasn't supposed to be done. I mean, remember in the 80s, we weren't even allowed to use a calculator for the classroom, let alone basically have software, be software sort of help you write music. But, a lot of other people around the world who were on CompuServe using Ataris appreciated the software. And they started sending me checks in the mail. And I didn't have a bank account yet because I was still a kid. So that was the opening for me in terms of, hey, there's something there. But I think there was also the other perspective of, for those of you who may know anything about Austria, certainly in the 70s and 80s, there weren't a lot of Asian people there back then. So you can just about imagine that from that perspective, I ended up having also a different sort of, even though I speak German fluently and I was effectively growing up like a local, it's a little bit like looking at it from an outside perspective as well, because, never quite in the society in some ways. So you kind of have a sort of disembodied experience almost, right? Where you can observe people in a way that they observe you because you're sort of there but separate in a sense. And I think the other thing that also gave me an impact and sort of, I think, formed some of the thinking in terms of how Animoca Brands started to form was because my mom used to work at the Komische Oper, which was in the eastern side of Berlin. So that background basically gave me an experience of what it was like, like when people talk about like real communism and what that actually meant. That gave me sort of that lens. And from that experience, then, I grew up in Austria, which is sort of a socially democratic place. And then because of Atari, I went to America, which was quite capitalist, right? Right? And then I ended up in Hong Kong, which is capitalism on steroids, right? And so sort of kind of went through all the extremes, and also observing the problems. I mean, it's not just that communism has problems, it's also that extreme capitalism, sort of ultra Milton Friedman's perspective of the world also has its problems as well. And all of that sort of provided, I guess, the lens as to how we sort of shape and think about Animoca Brands as a business today.
Absolutely. And Atari, I imagine this is kind of like right in its heyday at the time, right?
Well, it was really at the fading side. So this was in the mid 80s. So at that point, Atari had already started to lose the gaming wars. So the Famicom, the Nintendo, had just come out, and there's this famous story that Atari actually rejected to become the distributor of the Nintendo Famicom because they said, we make our own game consoles. Well, then Nintendo just launched it and distributed it and basically just killed Atari off pretty much in the gaming side. But there was a part of the business that was actually still thriving at the time, and that's the unit that I ended up working for, which is the Atari ST. And the Atari ST, for those who may remember and are as old as I am, or maybe even older, would remember that the Atari ST, the real competition at the time for the early days, wasn't really the Commodore Amiga, which is what a lot of people thought of, but was actually the Mac, because it also had this monochrome monitor that made it very easy to do word processing and for music composition and that kind of stuff. It was actually, especially in Europe, in German-speaking Europe, was a sort of very popular top choice as a office computer, for instance, and as a productivity computer back in the day. So that did quite well. But when Atari, sort of Germany, which was basically the headquarters for Atari in Europe, sort of wanted to pursue the computer direction, the headquarters in the US, which is really the parent in Sunnyvale, were trying to get back into gaming with the Atari Jaguar and sort of rejig the entire organization and basically evaporated the PC business. Even though I thought it was doing pretty well, but I was pretty young back then, so I didn't really know the intricacies. Anyway, yeah, that was back then.
And so, well, then I guess Sunnyvale was that starting to then? Could you start to feel the vibe of like entrepreneurship when you were there?
No, I mean, I didn't feel the vibe of entrepreneurship really because I was there. I felt the vibe of entrepreneurship because when they sent me to the US to study computer science, Atari went under, and so the vibe of entrepreneurship was very much the vibe of, oh, we got to do some shit. What do we do? Oh yeah, let's start a business to support all the other people that need Atari support. It made logical sense, and a bunch of ex-Atari guys, including myself, formed this new little business that originally started to really sort of be literally customer support and software patches and updates for all the guys who had literally just lost their service for Atari. Because remember, back in those days, it wasn't common to sort of buy a new computer every 6 to 9 months, right? Right? You would buy a computer and it's supposed to last you for 10 years or something. At least that's the idea, right? It was a long-term investment. And so, losing basically Atari headquarters meant that there was not going to be any new software updates. There wasn't going to be new hardware. So we decided to sort of, set up a little sort of business to support that. And entrepreneurship wasn't really cool back then, especially young entrepreneurship. It was really more like, well, if you don't really know what you're doing in life and if you're unemployed, then maybe you should start a business because there's nothing else for you to do, right? I mean, that was kind of what that looked like. I mean, today, of course, if you're a startup founder and so on, it's cool. But back then, it was absolutely not cool. It was almost somewhere akin between hopelessness, unemployment, or reject, or something like that.
Now everyone's an entrepreneur. I don't know.
That's right. Exactly.
And so then can you just so some of the early ventures, right? So you go out, it's so funny as you're saying this because I just see these cycles. You can just see the cycles, right? So a bunch of the the top developers from Atari go out, start a new business. What business was that?
So the original business was around supporting basically Atari, the Atari sort of entities. Or like, for instance, someone needed a software patch or someone needed some updates. And then later on, because we were, focusing on multimedia, we created 3D rendering software so people could continue. And then we even created sort of hardware add-ons. So we, part of the business ended up creating these plugins where we took the VGA graphics card that were working on PCs, created a plugin so that we could upgrade the resolution of the Ataris back then. Because back then, the Atari color palette was literally 4,096 colors. That's it. Okay, it wasn't like that was the entire color palette of the computers back then. And so we sort of created those kind of upgrades and so on and made some money. But of course, it was a sunset business because no new Ataris were being made. So we ended up pivoting into writing software using our 3D modeling expertise into essentially OpenGL modeling tools, which was back in the early 90s, was basically a standard that SGI was pushing to become sort of that modeling standard. And SGI back then was most famous for creating sort of all the visual effects for these like movie movies and 3D animations. And I think Pixar was using SGI machines back in the day as well. And then what happened was because of what happened with the growth of the internet, and Sun Microsystems basically started to dominate the space as essentially as effectively the internet machine. SGI felt like, oh, we should be doing that. And they ended up basically pushing out this thing called SGI WebForce and asking basically that modeling tools be focused on something else. And, born was sort of the support for this new standard called VRML, which is basically the HTML version of VR. And so we basically had our modeling tools support VRML, which is basically, imagine Tron line graphics, basically building like literally like an early metaverse in the 90s, but where everything looked like Tron, just worse. And
Tron's pretty cool though. It's back. It's back.
Yes, exactly. But Tron today looks cool because and you've got the human characters and you've got other stuff. This was literally just line graphics, right? And people then thought, we're going to go shopping this way. And I suppose we could be, except that the visual sort of acuity and the graphics just wasn't good enough to be doing what it is doing to what was necessary. But I guess you could say we had a very early start in sort of VR. I guess VR experiences back in the day without the goggles. So yeah.
Absolutely. And so how does Outblaze come about? Is that like an iteration of that?
Yeah. So the story of Outblaze was a little different. The story of Outblaze was, what happened was that I was sent out to Asia because I was the Asian dude in the team. Literally, that was the business plan. Oh yeah, you're Asian. I'm sure you're happy to work out in Asia. Sure. I was young and single. Like, I didn't care, right? But and for a lot of people back then, traveling and working overseas was hazardous. It's like they didn't want to leave, right? So that was kind of, so any person who was willing to go was literally like, it's your job, go ahead and take it, right? Which is great. So I ended up being in Japan, I went to Taiwan, then I came to Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, I discovered that people didn't have email. So I was like, okay, well, not particularly enjoying the corporate life. My father was actually from Hong Kong. So I was able to get permanent residency, even though I didn't know what that meant back then. So I didn't need a visa to work here. So that kind of, the stars kind of aligned, right? It looked like we needed the service. I could live and work here. I didn't enjoy what I was doing working for corporate. So I had basically started an internet service provider in Hong Kong, in the mid 90s called Hong Kong Online, which was one of the very first ISPs here.
Wow.
And from that experience, we ended up, Outblaze wasn't born from that, but from that experience, I really struggled because selling internet services in Hong Kong in the mid 90s was a little bit like selling fridges to Eskimos. They just didn't know what it was for. It was really, really tough. And what then happened was I pivoted it to say, okay, we were doing a free email and sort of website hosting / blogging, early blogging service, which was called Hong Kong Cyber City. And that was, at least in terms of usage, a success because we had like 300,000 plus users, which back then was a big number, sign up and sort of post their experiences and their websites and all that kind of stuff. And you can still see some of those first experiences if you use like the Wayback Machine, if you really want to go back and have some sort of nostalgia on these things. But then, I couldn't make any money because I tried to sell advertising and nobody was willing to pay any ads because there was no advertising model yet. But then I guess as fortune would have it, the whole dotcom craze started in the US. And this sort of little known fish oil company, which was a listed company, decided to become a dotcom play and went ahead and started acquiring, I don't know how many dozens of like internet companies that were sort of dotcom type companies, just buying traffic. And we happened to be one of the lucky ones that they said, hey, we'd like to buy, probably also because we were cheap because I didn't know anything about valuations. But either way, I'd happily sold it to them. And that's where I made, I guess, my first sort of initial buck, for which then allowed me to start Outblaze. And Outblaze is basically an early cloud computing business, although back then it was called ASP, Application Service Provider. And the idea really was, look, I'm not going to compete with Yahoo. I'm not going to compete with GeoCities. I can't raise that kind of money because back then Yahoo bought GeoCities for $4 billion, right? These were, back in the day, unimaginable numbers. So I basically just said, okay, well, how can I I still believe in the internet and in Web 1 and in open source, which is how we had built all of my early tools. So how do I continue to participate in this? And so we basically built a picks and shovels business, right? Which was basically effectively the ASP / cloud computing company, Outblaze. Well, we would allow other companies to use our tools. We would be a white label provider, and they would basically power, using our backend, their communities. That was kind of the birth of that. And we grew very quickly that way. And really the sort of, let's call it, massive growth we experienced was when the dot-com bubble burst. Because what happened was that all of our competitors that were built on expensive Sun Microsystems and NetApp systems and whatever no longer had the funding. And still, as it turned out, if you may recall, there were some articles that said the internet is a fad, nobody cares about it, it's all done, right? But it turns out that even though, the valuations of these companies were crushed, the users actually wanted the service, but they could no longer run it in the cost basis that these hardware companies were running them at. So this is where we came in, because we had built everything on Linux because we kind of broke. So we had to build everything on open source. And we were one of the largest Linux deployments in the world back in 2001. And that's when our business really, really grew. And we powered like Verizon, Juno Online, Mail.com, Register.com, Network Solutions. Like back then, all the major messaging providers were powered by us.
Wow. And so I'm sorry I kind of harp on the background, and I'm mindful of your time here too.
No problem, of course.
Yeah. But so this is the kind of your first, I guess, taste of kind of going global as well. Do you want to talk about the early days of taking a business international? Got a lot of entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a little bit natural for us because of the fact that because of my experience earlier in Europe and the US, selling overseas was actually not as difficult. It wasn't so much a cultural gap. I would argue that selling into a market like China would have been a much, much harder cultural thing for me to do, because I actually never conducted business in China before, right? So that's one. But the second thing also, remember in the sort of early 2000s, the internet in Asia wasn't really that big. I mean, it was emerging, but it wasn't that big. All the internet and online activity was happening in the West, right? It was happening in the US and to some extent Europe. So our customer base were naturally there where the market was, and that happened to be US at the time. So that's kind of the circumstance of that. And we attended conferences and we made pitches and we met companies, and it was kind of a B2B play. But it wasn't, I guess it was just part of the grind, right? You want to put up the business and you have to go sell, and when literally had to go door to door and make it happen. So that was kind of the early days. And we had one advantage, as I said earlier, our price competitiveness was second to none, because we were the only provider back in the day that was using open source. Because when we were deploying on open source, many of our competitors basically made sort of fun of us, and literally the pitch was, do you really want to trust, code that's written by strangers that you've never seen before, right? That was literally the threat, right? It was like, and many of the large corporations back then said, yeah, I'm not sure. And remember, they could easily raise hundreds of millions of dollars, so no problem spending $50 million on NetApp servers and $50 million on Sun servers, and then some crazy infrastructure which cost literally like $4 to $5 to $6 to $7 per month for Mailbox. We ended up basically sort of having the open source solution, which ended up becoming obviously the right one. Of course, today everyone uses open source, everyone uses Linux, but back in the day, very few companies did. So that sort of gave us that competitive advantage where we could literally go in and say, okay, whatever he's offering, 20 times less, like not 10% less, 20%, literally, like, just undercut. Someone, he's selling it to you for $2, I'll sell it to you for 2 cents, right? So that's kind of literally the price differential that we were able to capture the market share. And at one point, at the peak of our business, I think something like 15 to close to 20% of all the world's email flowed through our servers during our peak time.
Insane. But, I'm conscious that I don't want to just give the highlight reel, right? I mean, there must have been like some times that you were completely stressed out or you screwed something up real bad. And I'd love to hear, ones you don't mind sharing, maybe the G-rated ones. But yeah. Because
I mean, look,
for the founders, right? Like, it's like,
I mean, there's so many of them, right? So I think the point is that there's always sort of something that to overcome. But I think back in the earliest days, if I had to sort of summarize, right? I mean, we had an early version of, I guess the earliest version of COVID was basically sort of SARS, right? And back in 2003 was basically when the SARS virus hit, particularly Hong Kong, right? And everything was shut down, and that was tough, right? Because we had to sort of, it wasn't just a health issue; it was the fact that our competitors would literally go and say, "Hey, you can't trust this company in Hong Kong because people are literally dying." I mean, that's kind of like that was kind of what people used to say, and so we had to deal with that. We had to sort of, cut costs, and we had to do all that kind of stuff. So that was sort of one sort of crisis. The other crisis I would say is, well, I wouldn't call it a crisis, but it's something that sort of runs deep. Is like I think generally speaking, if you run an organization that sort of stays relatively true to its core values and relatively true to sort of what you believe in, then I think generally you'll steer it the right way. I'll give you an example, like without naming names, obviously, like when Outblaze messaging business was about to be acquired by IBM, right? Which was, I guess, a more significant exit, and eventually would pave the way for what became Animoca Brands. A number of people who knew that if they didn't join, the deal might fall apart, basically blackmailed the company to say, if you don't give me a huge amount, then we're just not going to do it. And it's very easy to kind of go, maybe we should, right? But then the thing is, you're not just sort of doing something unethical. You're also taking away from all the others who might deserve something. And, the whole thing was just completely unjust. And so we just stood our guns, stuck to our guns and said, look, if you want to do this, that's fine. You go tell your colleagues why this happened, right? You tell them, what happened, and that's fine, right? And we just don't do the deal, and tell me, right? It was kind of a, I guess almost, it wasn't exactly a prisoner's dilemma scenario, because they were all, that particular group of people were colluding together publicly anyway, but they had to make that decision, right? And at the end of the day, while there were some holdouts, I think most of them basically relented and said, yeah, because it wasn't just about them, it was about others as well, right? If you have to realize this is not just about them, and so we ended up still doing the deal. And I would say the lesson on this one, which was a very difficult one, because imagine if they didn't. Well, first of all, they'd obviously be fired, but the deal wouldn't have happened, and there wouldn't have been money. And would that have been the right choice? But at the end of the day, I don't think. For instance, for myself, I don't think I would have been able to it wouldn't have sat well. It would be something that I wouldn't be able to sleep on anymore I wouldn't sleep well, because at the end of the day, it was something that so violated, I guess, your own principles that it's just simply not worth it. Right? And I think that's important for founders as well, to think of what are the right principles. You have to be pragmatic, of course, but what are the principles that are so valuable to you that you're simply not going to sort of violate? Because if you do, you have these issues of, well, if you're violating one principle in your business that is supposed to be sacrosanct, then what's the other thing you'll violate? What else? And the rest of the organization will follow that as well, right? Because they're like, okay, well, if this thing is no longer sort of sacred, then maybe nothing else is sacred, which is basically the breakdown of culture within your organization. And that to me is more damaging than sort of, let's say, taking a hit, but staying true to your values and culture, I would say.
I really love that. We had a guy, help us at Startup Grind from Oracle, Reg Wintle, his name was. Same thing. He gave this presentation that's stuck with me till today around, companies have these visions and value statements, but a lot of people don't have their own personal one. And so he was, kind of preaching the concept of having your own value statements and your own kind of vision, and that being, hey, if you ever come into some sort of dilemma, you got something that you can refer to that says these are the lines I'm not prepared to cross. And so I love that, and I appreciate you bringing that up, even if it meant millions of dollars, which is the time that you need to,
Yes.
it's the hardest
of
time.
Course. Yes.
So onto Animoca, and we got so much to cover, because we got you're on advising the BAFTAs, you got there's the exchange in Liechtenstein. There's so many things that you're doing, a lot of I think support for education there as well. But maybe just a quick, are we okay for time? I'll edit this bit, by the way, but
yeah, sure. I mean, we can do a little bit. We can do a bit more, but I do have to probably leave in about 25 minutes.
Oh, that's
Sorry.
fine.
Yeah.
I'm fine.
Okay,
I'm
good.
thinking. I'm thinking like 10.
Oh yeah, good.
Yeah. So if we could start with the kind of the journey onto Animoca, right? And was that after the exit, and then what was there a problem that you saw in the industry? How did that all come about?
So I mean, I think much of my life journey has been very much around sort of circumstance and happenstance of personal curiosity, but always trying to solve something that I thought was important, but not necessarily knowing where it would lead, right? And one of the earliest things that, because of the non-compete I had with IBM, I could not go into enterprise for 3 years. So no messaging and that kind of stuff, right? Because maybe we would have built maybe a competitor to WhatsApp, who knew? But anyway, we weren't allowed to do that. So we didn't do that. But I was an early iPhone user, and I was also an early father at the time, a young father, and with young kids. And we were basically building, I was carrying on these flashcards to sort of, for those of you who remember the Baby Einstein flashcards, we literally show the flashcard in front of the kid and say, Apple, right? And hope it imprints into the child's brain that an apple looks like an apple.
For 20
right?
years, but we
Yes.
do our best.
Yes, exactly, right. That's right. And then next thing you know, you would end up carrying hundreds of these cards. So I just told my team, hey guys, can you just please put all of this stuff into an app on my iPhone? And so I can just literally stick an iPhone to my kid so that he can sort of leave me alone a little bit while we can sort of have a nice meal with my wife, while at the same time I can, sort of hope that he's at least doing something quasi-educational, right? So that's kind of the beginning of that. And then what happened, and this was 2008 or 2009 now, after a few weeks or a month, I forget the period, when the app was launched, which was really just built rather selfishly to serve my purposes, the team came up and said, hey, did you know what happened? It's like, I don't know, tell me. So the app was downloaded millions of times. So apparently millions of other people around the world seem to agree that putting a multi-$1,000 device in the hands of a sort of toddler was a good idea, right?
Yeah, and worth
to keep
15
peace.
minutes apiece.
Yes, exactly. So it was worth it. Clearly, it was worth it. So that's when we that really sort of piqued our interest, not only because we saw sort of the potential of people agreeing with what we're doing and for education, but also we saw the distribution power that was available on the device, like an iPhone and eventually iPad. And so, in fact, a little known story about the pre-genesis of Animoca Brands is that we were building educational games for probably the first year and a half. So all of our expertise was built things like things like Alphabet Car, flashcards, learning apps. We were just doing all of that kind of stuff, and it was growing quite well. And then we decided, we were going to do a mobile game and start utilizing this newly launched thing. It was only like 6 months old in the App Store, called in-app purchases. And we launched an application called Pretty Pet Salon. And that was really the birth of Animoca proper, because what happened was that when Pretty Pet Salon launched, it was an instant hit, because of in-app purchases, because of the design. It was basically kind of a sort of time management game, but where you're literally grooming pets. That's it, right? It was very cute. It was very fast. It was very skill-based. And we ended up making, hit like the first $1 million in like 2 weeks of launch, which is okay, I think we've got something big here. And from there, basically, built out basically a mobile gaming business that was sort of pre-Animoca Brands, was sort of the predecessor, which is Animoca itself, and launched hundreds of apps, where we basically very aggressively cross-promoted. Effectively, you could call it a kind of growth hacking of the sort of app store, which then eventually led us to being delisted, basically led us to being kicked out of the app store, because apparently, and we won't never know the truth, they didn't like our marketing techniques. And one day, I remember this was, in early 2022, I was at the airport, and the team calls me up and says, our apps have all disappeared. I was like, what? So I cancel my flight, go back, and lo and behold, basically, all of our apps were gone. You have to understand that at that point, somewhere between 10 to 12 of the top 20 apps on the App Store were all Animoca-related apps. Right?
Wow.
So that was sort of our first big experience in being completely deplatformed by sort of a major Web2 company, in this case Apple, that controlled the closed ecosystem. So anyway, we managed to sort of sort that out after a year and a half, and I won't have to go into the detail of the story, but we never recovered our pole position that we had as a mobile gaming company, because we were banned for so long. Built the business out on Android first, and then what happened was our studio was involved. This was in Vancouver. We had a studio in Vancouver that was involved in building sort of a little project that it happened to sort of do so in partnership, or really with a co-tenant called Axiom Zen, and which was basically CryptoKitties. So and the co-founder of that business, who was supposed to basically originally lead our North America efforts, Mick, ended up becoming a co-founder of what eventually became Dapper Labs, right? And And what we said is, okay, when Mick said, hey, look, I might be doing this instead, they said, okay, fine, you go ahead, do this, but we must become publishers of CryptoKitties, and we need to become investors in what will become Dapper Labs. And that's basically the journey, really, if you think about where Animoca Brands went into Web3 and NFTs in a really, really big way, where we sort of, you could say we saw the opportunity that we felt was powerful, which is that, with CryptoKitties, you have NFTs that, these digital property that you now own as a gamer or as a user, and have sovereign control over that. That was really appealing, and we thought new businesses would come out with that. And we penned this article in early 2018 and sort of made presentations on this key concept, which is content is the platform, right? Which kind of drew us back to the early idea of, well, we are no longer, we shouldn't be experiencing sort of what we value in someone else's platform. People, if they have sort of the content that is valuable, then people will come to you, right? That's the meaning of content as a platform, because NFTs can make content become an asset, and therefore you can start building an ecosystem around the ownership of these assets. That's how it all started. And in order to help build this ecosystem, and this came from my own experience in angel investing, because while sometimes we struggled with the growth of our business, I can't tell you how many times basically I ended up making either payroll or ended up making basically a sort of a little bit of personal money, because of the fact that I had at that point probably done 80 to 100 personal angel investments back in the day, and so we kind of took that mindset into investing into companies in Web3 as well, which was kind of like, how do we build an ecosystem? Well, let's go invest in the players in the space. And by good fortune, there weren't that many players to begin with, so it wasn't too hard to find them, right? And that's how we put in our first checks into companies like Axie Infinity and OpenSea, obviously Dapper Labs and Wax and Decentraland, and Polygon acquired Sandbox, and today it's over 400 companies. But back then, right, it was it was a handful of early companies that today have become household names, but back then were unknown sort of companies that we sort of invested, kind of taking that sort of early sort of investing style, which basically became part of the Animoca DNA.
Yeah, absolutely. We covered my next question, which is kind of like that. When was that aha moment with Web3? It sounds like you were like front lines with all of it, and probably also kind of subconsciously holding a bit of a grudge with Apple, right? I imagine that would have been such a painful kind of thing, and that was almost like the the reliance on the platform, right? Which is kind of one of the promises of Web3. Yeah,
that's right. But it wasn't just a reliance for Apple. It was also stuff on Facebook. For instance, you had to follow Facebook rules, or Twitter that would remove competitors, right? And it was just generally sort of the fact that we were suddenly living in a platform world, which is totally against the original promise of the internet, right? The original promise of the internet was free and fair access to information in an unrestricted fashion. Suddenly, it was kind of restricted, and in this way. And so Web3 really solves that problem for people. But of course, back then, we didn't have a solution for it. And most of us didn't think that Bitcoin, the technology that would create Bitcoin was going to be the framework for that. Because, obviously, certainly I had, and many people had heard about Bitcoin at that point, or at least interacted with it. But this idea that this sort of distributed ledger was going to actually be the framework for sort of a more fair and open internet didn't occur to people, because the network was not performing very quickly. And so it didn't seem to make sense at the time. But of course, many people had missed the point that, a consensus-based mechanism isn't meant to be the fastest thing in the world by design.
Got it. And so, like, just wrapping it up, I suppose, the kind of the evolution, right, of Web3 and the metaverse, and like, and I'm curious just to hear your thoughts, right? And the question I've kind of been asking a few of the guests lately, particularly if they're on the creator side, is there a way to kind of decouple what's happening in crypto land and FTX and all that kind of stuff with what's happening in the creator space? Because it seems like it affects it, obviously does, and it affects, like, less creators creating stuff and less people building stuff, and so it's a big question, but and probably
So I think the first of all is generally what you're describing is a Western or particularly US narrative.
Got it.
So this idea that people are sort of not looking at crypto or not building in Web3 or sort of doing less with NFTs is a predominantly US sort of topic. If you look at Asia, Middle East, especially Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, certainly South America, even parts of Europe, like for instance France, like Paris is like completely NFT crazy, right? Then you can see the whole ecosystem in Web3 and NFT is absolutely thriving, and it's growing really, really fast, right? So that's not so I would say, if you're in the US echo chamber, you might feel this way, but outside of the US, it's absolutely not the case, right?
I was in Paris. I was in Paris with you,
yes.
by the way. Yeah.
Yes, and you could tell, right? The energy was electric.
Oh
right?
yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah, it was amazing, right? So if you go there, you wouldn't think that this is a crypto winter. Like, what the hell's going on here, right? Like, everyone's just talking and building and excited about the future. And so I think this is really sort of, I guess, one important thing to consider, that it has not only to do with whether people understand or not. It also has to do, I think, with the perspectives of capitalism. So meaning that in America, unfortunately, for a lot of, perhaps the majority of young people, capitalism has not worked really in their lifetime. And so you can see this in sort of playing out in sort of political terms, where, when I grew up, right, the idea that that could be American politics on the basis of a effectively socialist platform would have been unthinkable, right? It would have just been political suicide to do that, say, even 1 or 2 decades ago. And now it's effectively the platform of the Democratic Party, right? To say, and to basically sort of go after people that are very wealthy, for instance. And this whole idea that, wealth, if they're very wealthy, is the wealth achieved actually really achieved in a fair manner? Is there something weird going on, or that kind of stuff? Which, by the way, was a European perspective, and maybe still is, right? Because I grew up in Europe, and people never spoke about money. And if you had money, you just hid it. You just sort of pretended like you didn't have it, because you couldn't talk about it, because otherwise you ended up becoming persecuted in one form or the other, whether it was societal or politically. But in the US, it wasn't the case. For the longest of time, sort of the meritocratic principle of you work hard and the American dream, then you'll make it somehow, right? Obviously, that sort of turned out not to be true for most Americans, unfortunately. Disillusionment sets in, and now people are thinking, well, if capitalism doesn't work for me, then what's the system that does work? And so crypto represents a digital capitalism, right? And also what's also problematic, I think, is that financial literacy is just so poor, which I think to me is a big hope of Web3. Because the whole thing about Web3 is that if you fully on board in Web3, it's not a technological thing only. It's a paradigm shift in thinking and a knowledge shift in thinking, meaning that you now have an idea of financial literacy. You know what property rights can do. You understand capitalism. You understand a certain level of economics, right? Talk to any person who's really deeply in Web3. He may not be an economist, but he knows enough about investing or sort of market making activities in terms of, what the market does, or sort of possibly investing or compound interest, like or yield, right? They understand that. That's what a true Web3 user is like. A true Web3 user isn't someone who used to play Web2 games and now plays Web3 games, and he just happens to have a wallet, right? It's someone who actually understands what it means. So that's really the onboarding challenge. And in Asia, the reason why people find it are much more adopting it as an example is that this idea of property rights and capitalism has worked for the minority of Asian people, because remember, in our lifetimes, most of us lived in this part of the world where we owned nothing, right? I mean, just think where China was 40 years ago. Just think where South Korea was. South Korea's GDP was lower than North Korea 4 decades ago, right? Yep. And now it's like the 12th or 13th largest GDP in the world. So this is sort of in living memory. We understand in our part of the world that, yes, there is going to be inequity, but we would still have a chance. Capitalism works for us. Whereas I think in the US, it doesn't. And so the sort of negative sort of feelings towards NFTs represents a little bit of that lens. Absolutely.
I mean, a couple of things there, you said it really kind of hit home. One is, I really had zero interest in finance, right? Which is like, I have a business degree and stuff, but it's not until I get into the crypto landscape that I'm learning it in a completely new way. But and so I never thought about that as a kind of education for a next generation as well. And then I think, I know
well, I mean, just quickly on this one also, when you don't understand finance, which most people don't, right? Think of the people around you that actually understand finance. It's very likely a single-digit percentage unless you work in banking or something, right?
Yeah.
But if it's general, like my mom is an artist, she didn't know nothing about finance. She was always taking advantage of people who were handling her business, for instance, right? There was, part of the course that, managers literally just, sort of take advantage of their artists somehow, and somehow it was okay to do that, right? Or, the fees that Spotify charges, whatever you call it, right? Because they don't understand actually what it means, because they lack the financial skills to do so. And so when someone ends up making money in a certain way, whether it's stocks, whether it's crypto, whether it's real estate, whatever it is, for people who don't understand it, it starts to feel a little bit like dark magic. It's like, wait, hold on a second. How do you make this money? I don't understand, which is a very common thing, right? They're like, I don't understand how you make money this way. I don't get it. How does it work? Right? And so this is really, I think, the problem that creates the inequity that we have today, which is that if we all had at least a certain level of knowledge, financial knowledge, shall we say, and financial discipline, then people wouldn't sort of sign up for the kind of debt that they do, for instance, or still pay 20% on credit cards. I mean, like, seriously, right? Like, it seems common sense maybe to us, but so many people still do it because they have no idea, right? So that to me is what needs to be solved here, and then we'll create sort of the right frameworks. And so people making money in this manner, and particularly in Web3, some people end up making money very quickly. Again, it feels wrong. It feels strange. It feels something's odd, and then people fear it. And so we just have to take the fear away by giving them knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, not to get too political, but I think as a US entity, I suppose I'm still allowed to say this because, one, I'm Australian, and two is because you probably heard Tim on stage saying that the US is like lagging behind now, with Europe and stuff. So I think I've got the blessing from the boss, right? So is US is just shooting themselves in the foot. Is it like, is there going to be maybe it's a change in leadership, and but it seems like I don't know how to say this. I'm going to probably have to edit this bit. I'll probably will. I'll leave it out. I wanted to go that there's kind of like I'm not a manhunt. The word I'm trying to use right now, where you've got like all the politicians trying to crack down on crypto and using FTX and all this kind of stuff as a way to push their own agenda. Am I fair in saying that?
So unfortunately, and this is obviously a personal opinion really more than sort of coming from any knowledge, so think of this as a bit speculative. Unfortunately, I think crypto has become an agenda item that is political in nature in the US, and is not a bipartisan effort to think about sort of what it really means, which is ironic, because I feel like the whole premise of digital property rights and Web3 and sort of the digital asset sort of narrative is actually much closer to American values, right, in terms of principles of freedom and ownership, for instance, specifically in the digital area. And the fact that it has this sort of censorship-resistant nature, really, if you think about it, is at the core of sort of the principles of sort of, basically free speech, for instance. And so it's really, really deeply ironic that a certain party in the US seems to have made it sort of its sort of rallying cry to go against it. But again, I think the motivations are political. I don't think the motivations are specifically around. That's not to say that there isn't scams. There is, but so is Enron, right? And so is Bernie Madoff, and these things happen, right? Because people sort of take advantage of systems, but that doesn't make the industry, that doesn't make the industry crooked just because of the fact that there's individuals that have taken advantage of it in a certain way or fashion. But somehow, I think it suits when you have an ignorant voting community that sort of looks at this in distaste. Then, if you want to capture that vote, right, then maybe that's one way to do it, for instance. That's a feeling I get, because it doesn't make sense, because this might be the very first time, certainly in my living memory, that the US would be ceding its naturally competitive advantage it has in a technological platform to foreign nations. That sounds incredible, right? And this idea that, okay, well, we'll focus on AI and forget about Web3 seems nonsensical to me, because at the end of the day, the official currency and the national sort of exchange medium for AI was going to be crypto anyway, because it's digitally native stuff that works for digitally native instruments, right? They're not going to open a bank account in sort of Citibank and sort of go through KYC because they can and start sort of transacting that way. It's all going to happen through crypto. So it seems strange. And then if you look at what Hong Kong is doing, right? Hong Kong is really advancing Web3 and sort of digital asset space in a really aggressive manner. And of course, we all know that Hong Kong isn't going to do something without the permission of someone else, right? So are you really going to let someone like sort of China sort of start to sort of have a meaningful say in this space, and you're out of the equation? Is that really the right thing to do? I mean, there's many questions around it on this, of course, but it just seems the wrong sort of thing to do for the long-term health of the nation.
Absolutely. Switching gears, last question, taking it to a new lane, new strategy, end on a high note. Right?
Sure.
I've got to make sure might have to edit some stuff. Don't want to both be in the papers. AI, you brought it up. I wasn't, yeah. So I'm convinced that like crypto sits perfectly. It sounds like you feel the same. Is that the, I wrote an article maybe just the other day around, I think it's the kind of the authentication and almost the
provenance.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's like I don't know, at some point I'm not going to know that you're you unless I have proof of it, or that I'm your representative. May be the case. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how AI is going to collide.
Yeah. So first of all, provenance we spoke about already. We also spoke about the fact that autonomous AI agents are going to be using crypto as its medium of exchange. I think that seems logical. But when you think about sort of authenticity and rights management, for instance, when our data sits on blockchain, then we can always audit the usage. And we can also sort of have a way in which value is distributed across it, because on-chain dynamics can support that in a way that's public and trustless, right? Which is something that becomes really, really critical, because which other method can you think of where you can have a trusted method which can scale with the kind of sort of information absorption that AI will have to use to create its output? So for instance, if I was to create, digital art, but through the works of 100 other people's copyrighted works or own work, well, a Web3 version of this is to say, okay, I ended up selling this particular piece of art for $1,000, and all the art that helped contribute, all the inspiration, you could say, that I used to create this art, I can now give them a share. So that means that everything, all the entire content space, basically becomes something that can share sort of appropriate value to its original creators, which to me is really how we solve a lot of the future inequity. Because to me, it's another part of building into the network, right? We're creating equity to the network. The problem is that we don't own anything in the network. And now in Web3, we can own a piece of that network, whether through tokenization, for instance, and then basically have a gross participation. I want to sort of give you an example of what TinyTab is thinking about in terms of education. What TinyTab does, first of all, from a sort of publisher NFT innovation is incredible, because it allows people who make maybe $10 or $20 or $100 a year on some content that they've made, on TinyTab's platform, to basically allow it to have capital formation. Because now, if you want to buy it for a 10 or 20% yield, something that makes $100 a year, which isn't a lot of money for a teacher in the US, but now that someone might buy it for $1,000, right, because of the fact that it generates 10% yield, that actually creates sort of a lot more sort of opportunities for teachers' intellectual property to actually become a capital asset. But the second thing, of course, is that when you think about how AI is going to be able to give you custom coursework and sort of give you custom materials to work from an AI standard that can customize to the individual student's need, while that's great, you still need humans to actually build and construct the right content for that particular category. And so something like, in Web3 education with Open Campus and TinyTab, we could, create sort of, millions of teachers potentially could be creating new content because they end up getting paid for that, right? And then someone else can buy that from them because it generates yield on the platform, for instance, and make an appropriate living, which means that the number of participants who sort of benefit from this will simply grow as more teachers make more money, as people who sort of end up paying directly to the teachers the value, but the entire ecosystem will grow. And then AI is going to pull out the right content because AI is probably the only real way in which, if you imagine you have a library of 1 million pieces of content, how do you get discovered, right? Yeah. You're not going to get discovered because there's an app store or a top 10. I mean, that might still be there. You're going to be discovered because AI is going to say, you're this profile or you're this kind of person. And I'm going to give you a learning course in English, putting it together with these 10, 20 things that I picked up that are ideal for you because you happen to like elephants, or you happen to like roses, or you happen to like cars, whatever that is, that gives you context, because every person is different. But to me, that's really the exciting opportunity, and actually creates more human potential, more work opportunities than, less.
Amazing. Yeah. It's really great to hear that, right? Because I am concerned about a world full of, mediocre content.
Yes.
Thank you, Yat Siu, for jumping on. Really loved every minute of the
No, my
conversation.
pleasure. Thank you.
Loved it.
Yes.
Cheers, mate.
Thank you for listening to Overnight Success. We hope you enjoyed hearing from our guests and learning about their inspiring journeys. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and share it with your friends. And remember, with hard work and dedication, anything is possible.